Welcome to our podcast, Fear Less, Do More. Here we're going to take a deep dive into the minds of some really daring, impactful change makers. I'm your host, Gill Hunter, and I'm the managing partner at Square One Law. In each episode, we're going to meet some innovators, some trailblazers, and we're going to talk about their successes, their fears, their challenges, and their lived experiences. We're going to understand their secrets to their resilience and their source of their passion, so that we can understand what drives them to achieve. These are all leaders who inspire us to step out of our own comfort zones and fear less, do more. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Fear Less, Do More. Today I'm joined by Sarat Pediredla, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Hedgehog Labs. Hi, Sarat.
Hi,
Welcome.
Jill. Great to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. Hedgehog Labs, what does it do for those who don't know as an introduction?
Hedgehog Lab is a digital product studio. We specialize in helping brands build digital products, working with a wide variety of sectors, really helping them fulfill their digital transformation needs.
And why hedgehog? Is there a particular meaning?
Yes. Earlier, I noticed the book Good to Great on the bookshelf there. And when I was forming the company, me and my co-founder were looking for some names for the company. And I'm a huge avid reader. I read a lot of books. And I was reading this book by Jim Collins called Good to Great, which I think is a great book. And there's this concept of the hedgehog concept in that book where he talks about effectively, if you can find an intersection of three things, which is what are you really good at, what are you passionate about, and what drives your economic engine. So if you can find a purpose in a business that fits in that center, he calls you the hedgehog company. Okay. So I was reading that, and obviously we were very passionate about tech and what we wanted to do. And I remember turning to my co-founder and saying, that's us, we're a hedgehog company.
And have you always been an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I have. I think with the exception of one job that I had for about a year and a half, I've mostly been an entrepreneur, really.
And what were you doing when you were employed?
I used to work for a company called Think. It was probably the only job I ever had. I mean, they're now called EPAM. They're based in town. And to be honest, I got a little bit of the inspiration and kind of the learnings for Hedgehog Lab from there. Because when I joined that company, I think we were 12 or 13 people. And within a year after I joined, it was a really fast growing company. And obviously, I really enjoyed what I did there, but I felt like I need to go out and do my own thing because I was a terrible employee.
Did you start life as a techie or on the marketing side?
Yes, I did. I started life as a techie. So originally, I was training to be a doctor. That was my passion.
Oh, right.
So since I was probably 5, 6, I always wanted to be a doctor. My parents wanted me to be a doctor. And growing up in India, there was only 2 ever careers you could do. You could either be an engineer or a doctor. And obviously, I was always interested in being a doctor. So my parents were quite excited about that. And I'd never really been into computers, so I was not always a techie. And in fact, I think I got my first computer when I was 15, I think. So I'd never really touched a computer since then. And I only got a computer because my dad brought it for me to practice for med school and really kind of learn everything.
Backfired.
Yeah, it did backfire. And then I think within a month, I taught myself like pretty much all the programming languages that there were. It was the early days of the internet in 95, 96. I was really excited about the potential of it. And I think within like 6 months, just as I'd gone into med school, I said to my dad, I don't want to be a doctor. I want to go into engineering. So since then, yeah, I've always been a techie at heart.
And is your dad pleased that you made the right decision? Was he?
It took him 20 years, but I think he's now proud. Obviously, when you have an ambition, like I said, for 10 years, and to be honest, I was obsessed with it. A bit like how I'm obsessed with being an entrepreneur. I guess, whatever I do, I'm obsessed with it. So I think it was a bit of a shock to them when it came initially, because when I decided to the pivot, particularly from an education perspective, I didn't do all the prep for technology. So all my prep was for for being a doctor. So all the grades I took, the subjects I took, was very much being geared towards becoming a surgeon. So it was a bit of a shock, but I think the last kind of 20 years, the journey I've gone on, I think my dad's kind of pleased with where I'm right now.
Yeah. And entrepreneurship, one of the challenges that the UK has is encouraging entrepreneurship and getting more people creating their own businesses. What would you say makes a good entrepreneur?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing, I think you've got to be a high agency person, right? I mean, I talk about, and I think, there's a lot of talk on the internet about I think there's kind of two sets of people. High agency people are kind of the forever optimistic, forever finding solutions. They're not willing to be victims. They're not willing to be, the people that things happen to. You've got to make things happen. And I think you've got to be high agency. Obviously, there's some attributes that come along with it, which is you've got to have a lot of resilience. You've got to have a lot of grit. But I think the best thing, if I was training my kids to be entrepreneurs, and I certainly try and at least instill into them this high agency that you have the capability to do what you need to do, and you take ownership and accountability for what you do. And I think you can't be an entrepreneur without being a high agency person, the kind of person that is looking at a problem and worrying less about the problem and really looking at how they can solve the problem or looking at the solution for it. So probably the number one thing I'd look for if you're being an entrepreneur is being a high agency person, really.
And you said there, about talk about the sort of training your kids. Do you think you can train to be an entrepreneur, or do you think it's something that lies within somebody that needs to be brought
out?
I
mean, it's interesting because I think for me it came naturally. I was probably the first entrepreneur in generations in my family. And partly my father was, as I said, was worried, not necessarily just because I shifted from being a doctor to an engineer, but more the entrepreneurship. He didn't really get how that worked. He didn't really get how business worked. I genuinely think you can be trained. I think you can have the right skills. I think there are fundamental, whether it's entrepreneurship or leadership, both those things, the classic saying that a leader's born or a leader's made. I think you can train, but to the point that we're discussing earlier, it can't start at business school. I think it needs to start much earlier in life, in primary, in the household, in parents, with families, etc. But I do think you can train people to think like entrepreneurs.
And I think a lot of people have a stereotype of an entrepreneur in their head of somebody who's really cutthroat and has a disregard for other people, will step on anybody to get where they need to get to. Your business that you have, Hedgehog Lab, prides itself in its culture and is known for looking after its people. Why do you think that sort of stereotype exists, and how have you bucked the trend there?
I think you're right. I think it's just not just about cutthroat, but I think if I take a positive spin on that, generally entrepreneurs are strong-willed.
Yeah.
They're very decisive. They're very single-minded. And I think a lot of the times it can manifest in those kind of things where a culture is very much about micromanagement. It's very much about, like you said, it's my way or the highway, or it's all about, for example, the numbers and the metrics. It's all about the profit, etc. But I do think, the last, I would argue, when I started the business 15 years ago, this wasn't the normal, right? I mean, it was quite a new thing. One of our values that we've got in our business is our people are our greatest asset. It seems quite cliched now because everywhere I look, everybody's saying that. But 15 years ago, certainly in my industry, in the digital product services or in the agency industry, they weren't looking at that as a statement and as an important thing. I think, in the last 10 years, with where management theory has gone, leadership theory has gone, and with people like you, Gill, for example, and the message being passed over, I think people are realizing there is a different way to do the things that you need to do. And why is that? I think one of the big challenges we've had is management theory from the 50s to 2000s was very much molded in that. So one of the people that I think is popular for this is Jack Welch. What he did at GE was lauded because he built a really tough dog eat dog competitive environment where GE was really successful. But I think that, age of management thinkers probably did a lot of disservice, because I think what people did was correlate cause versus results. So because Jack Welch was so successful in that age with his management style, which was about trimming the bottom 10% of people, which was about, making managers compete with each other, and, that hard-nosed management, I think people just bought into that, because you see a few outliers. You see people like Bill Gates, who was quite, an angry person, etc. And you kind of correlate the negative aspects of their success to what, probably were other reasons. And then that became general management theory. Whereas now I think, with better leadership thinking, I think people can start recognizing that actually there is a different way to do this. And there isn't like a templated model of, hard running, micromanaging, really, really intense pressure situations. And I think that's being seen now. Some of the best businesses now have great cultures.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I mean, my sector has been pretty much centre of the hustle culture for quite a long time, and I, as you do, believe that there's a different way of doing things that has a more positive outcome. And I think that's a really interesting perspective, that people have automatically assumed that because those cultures were as they were, that's the reason behind the success. But there will be other stuff going on behind the scenes that you don't see that have been the reason for the success. So what's the culture like at Hedgehog? What have you tried to create at Hedgehog Lab?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the culture starts, and there's a couple of things. We talked about the founding story of Hedgehog Lab. Alongside the name, one of the things me and my co-founder Mark wrote even before we founded the company was our culture framework. So we've got a clear kind of set of structure around what our culture means. And the first thing we started with was our purpose. And the purpose, actually, if you compare it to the purpose of, say, a Google or some of these lofty things about solving world, hunger and peace and all these things, our purpose was very simple, which was to create a place that empowers talented people to do the best work of their life. And that was it, because I'd worked in both entrepreneurship and business culture, and I didn't see where culture was being valued. Even think, great organization, and when I look back, there was a lot of good learnings for that. I don't think at that time, because the general management theory wasn't there, the aspect of culture wasn't as recognized. It was very much about metrics and numbers and sales and all of those things, despite being really fast growing and doing well. So I think, the key thing we looked at and what was different for us is we had a culture framework from day one. Yeah. Writing that purpose then started to allow us to think about our values. It started to think about, our mission, etc. And actually, one of the things I always say to people is culture is not like a fixed thing. The culture that Hedgehog Lab has now is not the culture that it had 15 years ago. But if you have clarity of purpose and a mission and vision, then I think the culture evolves. So I also take a bit of offense at people saying good cultures and bad cultures. So for example, a great example is Apple, right? Today, Apple is one of the most successful companies in the world, and there are people who will give an arm and a leg to go and work at Apple. But in the traditional definition of culture, so you talk about, lawyers being overworked. People at Apple are constantly overworked. They work ridiculous hours. It's a high pressure situation. There's lots of secrecy, etc. So all the antithesis to what we would argue is a good culture. But I think where Apple has done really well is it's clear about its culture. And it says, if these are the things that you value and you communicate that, and this is what you want out of life, then come and work here and you'll enjoy it. So I think for us, that's been the big thing. It's not about, the well-being or the DEI, all the things, they're all important, but we've been clear about what is the things that we value, which is bringing talented people and empowering them to do the best work of their life. And so I think having the clarity of your culture, I think has allowed us to build such a good organization.
And another of the things that I really admire about the business is this concept that you have about your customers, and that what you want is for your customers to become fans.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a really great way of encapsulating, your aim, your purpose around your customer experience. Where did that come from?
So that's actually one of our values. So, we have 4 values. One of it is obviously our people are our greatest assets, or our team is our greatest asset. One of the other values is turning customers into fans. And it was really interesting because fans is not usually a word you associate with business world. Like, you don't have fans in B2B. Fans is what you associate with athletes and sports people. And, so that was a word we deliberately chose because for us, the ironically, we're not in the business of tech, right? We're actually in the business of customer service. And so if we're able to deliver whatever our customer is looking for, which is most usually because we're in the tech industry, a technical outcome or a digital outcome, but actually treating it as a professional services job rather than a technology job. So in that way, I don't think we're any different to lawyers, for example, or accountants. We're in the professional services industry. And I say this to my team all the time. In fact, when we do onboarding, I do like a presentation and I ask people, what industry do you think we're in? And people will go, oh, we're in mobile tech or like AI. And I'm like, no, we're in the customer service industry. So for us, that was a deliberate, this is the point I was making about culture. You get the culture you devise and you set out to do, and we want to build a culture that is very customer centric. Now, look, admittedly, we've fallen, below that benchmark a lot of the times, and that's kind of part of the great thing about culture frameworks is you're probably never going to be that utopia that's perfect all the time, but it's a guidepost to the point of, you have clarity. And when someone says, oh, well, what is our culture like or where are we going? You can point back and say, that is our culture and that is what we're aiming for. And so turning customers into fans as a professional service organization, I think is going beyond the normal, right? You can just have, they say, what's wrong with just having customers? But for us, it's about, we want them to turn into fans and really kind of rave about us. And so I think it's quite a nice aspirational goal to have, particularly in professional services.
And how do you know when you've achieved that?
I think one of the leading metrics certainly for us is simply things like customer retention, right? So if we're able to keep working with that customer in a long period, then that's quite obvious. We also have trailing metrics now. We're looking at things like NPS, for example, and historically we've not been great in terms of measuring NPS, other than we have an industry standard thing called Clutch, which we use for posting customer reviews, etc. But we don't have an ongoing conversation with them. So we're improving that. We've got a new head of client engagement that's supporting that process. But I think the easiest metric as far as the business metrics go is how long has that customer stayed with you, and what's the quality of the relationship, and at the basic level, it's the amount of money they spend with you.
And the business has been very successful, and you've grown a lot. You've expanded internationally. How has that brought a different dimension to the business?
Well, culturally, it's been really interesting because one of the things that I think people underestimate, including myself, when you expand internationally, is the understanding that you can't just copy paste a culture. And this is where I talk about. So we talk about Hedgehog Lab as a culture, but we also have regionalized and localized cultures across the different regions. So we actually have three bases really. We're in the UK, we're in the US, and we're in Bulgaria. And all the cultures are slightly different because you got to be sensitive about the local aspects of things, whether it's legal, whether it's just the way things are done, just the expectations, etc. So we've had to adapt that, and I think again, when people talk about having a culture, it's actually a mix of different little, like almost like a microbiome of different cultures that mix together. So that's been a really interesting learning experience for us in terms of, yes, you can have like a company culture, but you've got to be flexible and adaptable because different geographic areas have different expectations on how you do things.
And you also, earlier in 2023, took investment, quite significant investment. That sometimes could be quite a challenging time particularly for founders who are giving up something of their baby for the first time. What was your experience of taking investment?
That's so the funding round we did with BGF in April was actually our second investment round. We actually took our original investment with Maven Capital Partners in 2017. And we were quite a small organization then. And actually, almost every agency, professional services consultancy founders at that time 5 years ago, it wasn't common for professional services companies in the consultancy sector, unless you're like, really mid-market, half a billion or so size, etc. Smaller agencies didn't typically take investment or private equity. So there was, it's quite, abnormal 5 or 6 years ago. But for us, it's been transformational. It's funny, so you say there is a lot of fear, particularly private equity, because we work with private equity and we've been through like two journeys. I think there's a lot of fear of private equity because of the bigger horror stories we hear of things like asset stripping, the ripping out management teams, etc. I think what you find is in professional services, effectively, what private equity are investing is in the people, right? I mean, what is the product? Like, we are not a SaaS company. We don't have intellectual property. We don't have assets in the sense of the typical buildings, and our equipment is not worth. So really, our assets are people. So I think when private equity invests in professional services, they look at it at a different lens. They look at it from a people investment perspective. And for us, it's been brilliant. When Maven invested, since Maven invested, we quadrupled the size of the company. When we went with BGF, and that's exactly now the aim. We want to 5x the organization in the next 5 years. And you made a point about, as a founder, giving up some equity. Of course, you've got to do that. But the way I described it when I took the first round, and some of my co-founder Mark, who at that time had an equal share as me, we had that discussion, and I said, the way you think of this, if you're pragmatic, is, would you rather have 50% of an organization that's worth £100,000, or would you rather have 20% of an organization that's worth £20 million? And so it's simple mathematics, and what private equity allows you to do is accelerate, but also de-risking. I remember when we took the Maven investment on, we were starting to get to a level, multi-million-pound revenue, where the wage bill was genuinely keeping me up. And we were a small organization. So, and like I said, the flip side of not having any assets in the business is you don't carry a lot of profit, like profits go in founder dividends, etc. So when your wage bill gets to 6 figures plus every month, that's quite scary. So yes, it can be frustrating in the sense that you're giving up equity and you potentially, have a downside in that. But actually, you could sleep better knowing that, particularly in professional services, where 60 to 70% of your costs can be people related, that you've got somebody, effectively investing the capital to look after that. So for us, it was liberating. The other angle that I think a lot of people don't realize, particularly when you're running a smaller professional services company, is the level of professionalization that the private equity brings into your business, whether it's having a formal board, whether it's building systems, because ultimately that's what they do. They take effectively an organization, really improve it in some way or format, whether it's with people or process, and then that's how they realize their gains. So I think it's been, I would have done the same thing again. While I think we've had challenging periods with COVID and we've had a couple of down years, I don't think I would have changed how I did it, really.
And how easy has it been to keep the culture intact?
Fairly easy. And I think, again, I've heard some horror stories where I think private equity don't probably understand professional services. But I think if you go with investors that understand professional services and are quite mature, so BGF is a great example. We're only about 5 months into that investment, but we couldn't be happier because they're a mature investor. They bring a lot of credibility behind them, and if anything, they want. Ironically, as we've grown up in terms of larger size investor, it's now become a board agenda item. I remember when we were smaller, culture wasn't a board agenda item. It was my priority, and as a CEO and a co-founder, I cared about it. But our CFO wasn't talking about it at that time. Whereas now our CFO is also on the metrics around culture. We're measured as a board on culture and the outputs of culture, which is things like employee NPS, well-being, sick days, all the things that you look at metrics. So I think it's actually become better, if not. And with private equity, have realized that, particularly, I don't think it's unique to professional services. Even if you're running a product company now, or a legal firm, or a manufacturing firm, they recognize the value of human capital, and that ultimately this is the kind of the way to retain and run the business right now.
It's a really interesting perspective, sort of, having made that transition from owner managed into having investment in. If I was a young techie with a relatively new tech startup, what would be your advice to me if I was looking for investment in terms of finding the right investment partner?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And also, I think particularly, I mean, first thing I'll say is if you're a young techie and you've got a lot of skills, etc., I'd probably do a startup. I know you've assumed that, but I think a lot of young people fear that but I think that's the time to take risks in your life. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have taken the risks I took when I formed Hedgehog Lab now. So it's much easier to take the risks. In terms of raising investment, I think there are probably two or three things really. First thing is, I think you've got to be really clear on what your business is and where the value in the business is, because I think ultimately the investors can see whether you can articulate what your business is about, whether it's a product startup, whether it's a professional services startup, etc. And I think the other thing I think a lot of young founders don't realize is they always think it's the idea that the investors are investing in. Oh, my idea is amazing. Look at this business plan, etc. But I think what they don't realize is they're investing in you, right? You're investing in you and the management team. So I would spend as much time on, and this is why culture is important, on you and your management team and the people that are going to be running that company, as much as on the product and all the typical tech things like product market fit and tech stack and all of those things. Yes, they're important, but if you don't pass the smell test of, are you a good person to invest in or not? Are you investable? There's a certain kind of investability in people. If you don't pass that test, then it doesn't matter if you have the most amazing product, if you have the most amazing tech thing. And I think a lot of the time, young tech founders get so obsessed about the idea, they don't work on themselves. For example, one of the things I wish I did when I was younger, and actually we didn't talk about it. Hedgehog Lab is my second business. My first business failed horrendously. And that was a practical experience for me in that I focused so much as a young tech founder, and the first business I did was a product business. There was so much focus on getting the product perfect, and I used to obsess over pixels, etc. But what I hadn't done is worked on myself. I didn't understand finances. I didn't have a go-to-market strategy. I didn't look at the kind of the whole picture of running a business. So I didn't really understand how to run a business. All I knew was I could create a great tech product. And then obviously it was no surprise that it failed, because a lot of young tech product founders, focus on the product or the tech and forget about the rest of it, which is working on themselves and the business.
So to have gone from that spectacular failure in your head, that's quite a fearless step then, to then go, I've made a mess of it first time, but I'm going to do it again. What helped you get over that fear of failure second time?
Well, I think people will call it resilience or grit. I just call it stubbornness, I think. I just refuse to accept. No, but I mean, I think you just get a lot of learnings. And I think, honestly, it was stubbornness. I think it's ironic. I didn't actually want to, the job I got at Think, I didn't really want to go into a job. It was circumstantial because I'd moved up north at that time and I'd just gotten married. And obviously, we were two young people. My wife had just finished her studies going into, so it's almost, the job was a necessity. I begrudgingly went into the job, although I enjoyed it. So for me, I felt like I had a point to prove after and I had a lot of learnings that came out of it. But some of it was, I think, just stubbornness, really. I just refused to, and I knew I was unemployable, right? So it was like, how am I going to make my way in the world? I can either be a freelancer, which I did for a while, but I really struggled to work by myself. I'm like a people person. I like to work with teams. I like to work with other people. So it was almost, it's inevitable that I had to form a company, because I was not great at working by myself. My motivation levels weren't great, and I was pretty much terrible employee. So it was just.
Why were you such a terrible employee? You said that a couple of times.
You know what? And I say that jokingly, but it's because I think in most organizations, people have clear roles and responsibilities and boundaries. And because one of the disadvantages of being an entrepreneur is you're constantly pushing at those boundaries. And in a lot of organizations, that's not a healthy thing. And I get that. Even my organization now, I think there are certain boundaries people shouldn't push because everybody has a role to play. And I think I just wanted to do more and more, and I was really ambitious. And ambition is good if it works for your organization, but if you're not willing to fit into that mold, and also I think at a simplistic level, I hate anybody telling me what to do. So I think I say that in a joking way because when I was at Think, I poured my heart and soul into it. But in reflection, I know I was difficult. I guess what I have empathy for is I was probably very difficult to manage. In the early years, I used to think, oh, I'm such a bad manager. But actually, you also have to reflect on your role in that relationship. And I think people nowadays, it's very easy to blame leadership and go, well, my managers are not great, my leaders are not great. But I think you also have to reflect on your role. So that's why I joke about being a terrible employee because I reflected on my role in that bad relationships, really.
So outside of work, what makes you happy?
I don't know. I'm probably sounds weird, but I'm an intrinsically happy person. Because I don't think something can make us happy, and I'm not going to like the whole philosophy and Zen thing. But happiness, you either have it or you don't have it, right? I mean, if you're seeking happiness, and Stephen Bartlett talks about this, he wrote this book called Happy Sexy Millionaire and stuff. If you're looking for happiness, say, if you go, well, I'll be happy when I become a billionaire. You're always looking externally to have it. So I'm generally happy, but I think in terms of like what do I like to do, I do a lot of reading. Obviously, I've got a young family, 2 kids, spending a lot of time with them, and I think a lot of the stuff I do is correlated to what I do at work. So a lot of self-improvement, a lot of interest in stoicism or stoicism. So I tend to do a lot of reading on that, and my wife's into psychology and mental health, so I'm quite interested in that. So pretty boring outside work, really. Pretty interested in just stuff like reading and stuff. Nothing controversial.
Well, that all sounds very interesting. So what's next then on a personal and a professional level? What does the future hold?
I think on a personal level, for me, it's about I think I've gone on a journey as a CEO and a founder, and I think there's never a stage where like you're the finished article. I think there's always something better you can do. So for me, I'm really cherishing taking on, and it's professional too. It's both interlinked because it's weird, but people talk about personal development. How much of that personal development is interlinked to professional development? I think this idea of, I hate, by the way, I hate the idea of work-life balance. So I prefer work-life harmony, right? Because it's not like you have to find, it's not like a tipping thing.
Yeah, find it 50-50.
Yeah, I think about like the yin and yang rather than the, like the yin and yang is not a perfect, semicircle. They interweave. So for me, a lot of what I do in personal life and how I improve and how I grow reflects on work. And the same thing, a lot of what I reflect. So for example, I'll give you a small example. I think I'm a better parent because I'm a better boss, because I've learned, the interactions with people. So one of the things I've learned at work in my professional development is when you're dealing with people, always, so the coaching habit, and if you do coaching, you go, what's going on for this person? And so I apply that with my kids. So when they're misbehaving or whatever, I tend to go, what's going on for them that I'm not understanding? So then that gives me a lot more patience, etc. So for me, I'm really looking forward. I think we've taken a new challenge on in the business. We're looking to, like I said, 5x this, grow it internationally. There's 3 or 4 big pillars. We're hoping to, hopefully be B Corp certified, for example. So there's a bigger journey to go on and scale the business. But the biggest challenge for me is effectively making myself redundant in the business, which I've not yet managed to do it over the last kind of 16 years. I've just built a new executive leadership team. So I'm really excited about how am I going to cross that chasm of being somebody that's been vital for the business, the person that investors back, to effectively, I think it was the founder of Bain that never used to come into he just used to come in the office to play golf, for example, right? I mean, I'm not saying I don't like golf, but to build a business that is effectively sustainable without me, and I think that's definitely professionally one of the biggest ambitions.
But I think that's great that you recognise that that's what's needed for the business to go to the next level. I think a lot of founders will struggle letting go of their businesses and accepting that it can be not necessarily better, but different without you, but it needs to be moving forwards. What are the sort of fundamental key things that will allow you to get to that point?
Firstly, it's tough. If I'm sitting here pretending like I've got it figured out, or,
I thought you had.
I'm not. It's really tough. I tried. To be fair, I tried that a couple of times, and I think it's really tough. And it's easy to blame. For example, once I tried, I thought, oh, I didn't hand it to the right person. But actually, on reflection, the way I did that wasn't the right thing, because you have to have a runway. You have to have a way to prepare. So if you're doing succession planning, you can't turn around, which is what I did in the past. You're running the business, and that's not the way to do it. So I think probably a couple of things for me is about, the first thing is, getting the right people on the bus, and going back to Good to Great, which is a book I quote all the time. And Jim Collins has this idea of first get the right people on the bus, then figure out where you got to drive it. So yes, it's important to focus on strategy, and I wouldn't have got investment without a plan and a strategy. But actually, and my investors know this, part of my strategy was, I'm going to get the right people on the bus. I'll spend the last 12 months. In fact, that's what I've done most of the last 12 months, is to find the right senior leadership team. And we're not at the end of that journey. We've found the right, top level team, but we've got to figure out the rest of the structure and make sure we've got the right people on the bus. I think if you do that, the rest of it becomes easy. But the second thing you've got to do, in terms of the, my bad experiences, you've got to prepare them, you've got to communicate, you've got to really set the scene for them to take over that ownership, because you can't have it, both extremes. You can't have the extreme where you don't turn up on a Monday and say, you're running the business from now, which was my past experience, or you're constantly there, looking over their shoulder, etc. It's got to be a halfway house where you're supporting them through the early stages of the process, but you mutually agree at a level where you go, actually, either because you're credible or you're an experienced person or you've done this before, where you can start handing over things completely to other people.
Yeah, and accepting that things might be done in a different way.
Exactly.
And people also need to make their own mistakes.
That's so tough as a founder. That is so tough as a founder. And particularly when you're a founder that you have the skills to do those things. So as an engineer, I've done most of the jobs that are going in the organization, from product management to sales to etc. So I think as a founder, I think, and we talk about skills to teach people. I think that skill is not taught. And I think, that's really difficult. But yeah, it's really important to let people make their own mistakes. And I think it tracks back to trust, right? And I think we all think, I like to think I'm a very trusting person, but like when you get to the nuts and bolts, you're not, because, you have this anxiety around things. So I think it's just kind of practicing the ability to just trust people and just make their own mistakes. Yeah.
And finally, the podcast is called Fear Less, Do More. What would you like to do more of?
That's a great question. What would I like to do more of? I think I'm kind of doing it, which is I'd like to challenge myself, to greater ambition. One of my not regrets, but one of my kind of reflections in the last 15 years is, I think we held back a few times, and I held back because either it was because of the fear of failure, or either because I just didn't know how to do it, or either because sometimes I just didn't back myself. I think we held back on our ambition. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm incredibly grateful in terms of where we are right now and the journey we've come on. But I think we could have been, for example, you talked about global. I think we were quite conservative in our global ambition. I think we could have done more faster. So part of the private equity thing was almost a challenge to myself. Like, it's almost like, oh yeah, okay, you've got all these ideas, like, go on then, like, let's execute this. So I think I'd like to do more of that. I'd like to expand that. Like I said, one of my personal ambitions has been to get Hedgehog Lab B Corp certified. In the early days, certainly people told me it was difficult, it was impossible, etc. And I think it is the right thing. It's the right way to run a business. So for me, it's about, like, what can we achieve in the next 5 years?
Well, I look forward to seeing how things do develop. I think there's an exciting future ahead. Thank you very much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Gill. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Fear Less, Do More. All of our guests come from a diverse range of backgrounds, but they all share a common drive to face their fears, take action, and create meaningful impact. If you've enjoyed this episode of our podcast, please follow us, Square One Law, on Instagram and LinkedIn, and share the content with your friends, family, and networks. Thank you, and see you again on our next episode.